My name is Myrna Skolny, and this is another video in my series on early Staffordshire pottery figures made between 1780 and 1840. Angels with their trumpets warble forth in most melodious strains on this early Staffordshire plaque as they introduce us to the expansive array of musicians captured in Staffordshire clay. Many, like this simple rural pastime pair, play the music of country life, and musicians in bucolic settings play folk music deeply rooted in rural tradition. This little fellow probably earned his keep on street corners, while these three bandsmen were Hessian soldiers. King George III hired them to fight in the American Revolutionary War, and their music was absorbed into American culture. We find figures of literary characters. Dr. Syntax was illustrated with his violin in popular books telling of his travels in search of the picturesque. And biblical figures. Here the potter, like artists of old, portrayed King David with his harp. To explore this broad topic, I'll focus on early figures of musicians that I've photographed in various private collections. The term early specifies figures made between 1780 and 1840, and I submit that the mark Neal & Co. impressed beneath both these figures qualifies them to start this overview. They were made circa 1780 at the pottery James Neal acquired in 1778. Neal figures stand head and shoulders above most others because of their exquisite enamels that were probably applied by skilled London painters. In this similar pair, again recognizably Neal, she's marked but he isn't. The odd thing about Neal musicians is that the mounds on their bases were never painted to match. In the late 18th century, the classics influenced design. This unmarked figure is the Greek god Apollo, the patron of music. Neal probably made it, but his partner, David Wilson, who owned Neal's pottery in his own right from 1789, made figures from Neal's molds, but they're often of lesser quality. This lady with a billowing skirt holds a horn, and she symbolizes the element air. She has Wilson's mark beneath. As you see, her enameling was not up to Neal's standards, but despite that, I rescued her because she's one of only two figures of elements from the Neal Wilson pottery. Around 1785, the potter Ralph Wood made this pair of Flemish musicians. Each one is stamped beneath R.A. Wood Burslem, R.A. being an abbreviation for Ralph. Note that the line bands only three sides of the base, as is the norm on Ralph Wood's enamel figures. Ralph Wood also made this pair of Flemish musicians. Although unmarked, each has Ralph Wood's model number 132 stamped behind, and that supports the attribution. Also in the 1780s, Wood made this bagpiper with 21, its model number, impressed into the base. This sweet little piper with puffed out cheeks and his companion with a cat are unmarked, but they exhibit definitive Ralph Wood attributes. At the other end of the size spectrum, Ralph Wood made this complex vase with a musical pastoral theme, and I have singled out the handsome piper on it. Potters reuse their costly molds when possible, so this musician appears again on this group, this time seated rather than standing, and for completion I show the group's companion alongside. Ralph Wood also made this pair, each titled Spanish Dancer, a lady with a hand drum and her companion with castanets, and they impressed 73 and 71 respectively. These figures capture the musician's fluid movements, and like all the figures we've seen hitherto, they're refined and their design was influenced by the fine porcelain figures the affluent admired. For a long time after Ralph Wood's death in 1795, other potters emulated his figures, and the Dutson pottery, established in 1808, made these Flemish musicians. The potter added large, gorgeous cloaks, each apparently fashioned by hand from a thin slab of clay rather than press molded in the usual way. Ralph Wood's cousin Enoch Wood made this Flemish musician. It is unusual in that it has Enoch Wood's mark beneath, and it was one of my first purchases decades ago. Another figure bought in those far-off days is this unmarked lady with a tambourine, dating to the early 1800s. She's beautifully modelled, but markedly different from the exquisite figures that Neil and Ralph Wood fashioned. The Leeds Pottery in Yorkshire made this little musician circa 1800. Leeds figures are enchanting, and they're instantly recognizable by the distinctive modelling of their faces. As we get into the 1800s, enamel decoration becomes brighter without being garish. This splendid spool vase oozes pastoral charm. At the same time, figure design increasingly reflected everyday life. This village group with its childlike musicians is typical and has a naive appeal. Groups of this sort are more easily procured than most, but the challenge is to find one in excellent condition. In this period, bocages become more common. Many musical groups include sheep that reflect the basic rural nature of the music, as we see in this group made around 1820. Another pair of musicians of the same period, their beauty enhanced by striking, crisp bocages. A stunning bocage elevates a figure to a new level. I must admit, I'm a sucker for a perfect bocage. We see gorgeous, flamboyant musical spill vases in this period. This is one of my favorites, and I rescued it from a collector friend who had tired of it, but I don't think I ever will. The potter Obadiah Sherritt made this pair of musicians. I bought the pair from my friend, the Sherritt expert, the late Malcolm Hodkinson, when I first visited his home at the turn of this century. Malcolm got me hooked on Sherritt, and I subsequently found this little Sherritt group. Sherritt reused these molds in other contexts, so you'll see the piper from this group alone as a single figure. Viewed from a better angle, he is a charming little man. Oddly enough, this figure came with another just like it, and as the two pipers have probably lived together for centuries, the collector wisely chose not to separate them. Collectors do sometimes trade figures, and a friend of mine had 2 examples of this sweet shepherd piper, so he parted with one. He's charming, sitting peacefully among his sheep on his island of clay. Sherritt made these shepherd musicians, and they exude naivete. The top knot on her hair is a typical Sherritt touch. Sherritt modified his molds to use the same musicians seated on this beautiful spill vase, and again their animals are with them. This pair of musicians is very much in Sherritt's style, but like several other figures from this pottery, they lack sufficient features for an attribution. They were made without bocages, probably in the 1830s. I have a keen interest in the potter John Dale, and both these musicians are impressed with his rare mark. I'm as smitten with them today as I was when I acquired them separately some decades ago. I bought the guitar player at auction. The only other example is locked up in museum storage. He is the only known pipe player, and the yellow staining in his crotch suggests he may have had an accident. Another potter used the molds for guitar player and piper to make these sweet figures. Potters sometimes bought molds from common suppliers, but they were not above copying each other's work, so there's no telling which pair came first. The great outdoor shows that traversed England attracted huge crowds, and this showman and showwoman appear to have stepped right out of some such scene. Small pairs of figures in fine condition are surprisingly difficult to obtain, but they can have ridiculously modest prices, and collecting them is so very rewarding. This little showman, another purchase from the start of my collecting journey, has immense presence for his small size, so much so that I used his picture on the spine of my first book. And yet another glimpse of the fairground in bygone days, a pair of musicians in oriental attire before a beautiful spill vase. These three rare Sherritt Fairground musicians are gems. The lady with the tambourine and the male organ grinder are also on some Sherritt menageries, again a repurposing of molds. Remember the organ grinder because, as you'll see, other potters made him too. These two animal troupes depict the animal shows that performed at fairs and assorted outdoor venues in the early 1800s. This is the only known pair, and they were made by an unidentified pottery dubbed the Patriotic Group. As you see, that same organ grinder model that Sherritt used now accompanies the monkey. More commonly, the Patriotic Group assembled these characters on one base, but this group is particularly challenging to procure with all the original figures present. Again, note the organ grinder. Alongside is a contemporary engraving of an organ grinder in much the same style. Dancing dog routines were among the animal entertainments at fairs and on street corners, and they routinely performed to a musician's tune, hence the piper on this stunning group. Travelling menageries were Britain's premier animal attraction then, and musicians lured the crowd to the very front of the menagerie. This is Womble's Menagerie, my favourite little menagerie, made in the 1820s with its musicians in beefeater attire lined up at the door. Sherritt made this Polito's Menagerie, and again you see the musicians on the platform. In those days, even those with no interest in animals would gather to enjoy the free musical entertainment laid on by the menagerie band. On this large Womble's Menagerie of the 1830s, Sherritt has now placed the familiar organ grinder on the left and a lineup of musicians across the platform. Musicians also played on London streets. Still remembered today is Billy Waters, a former American slave who played the violin in the theatre district. This peg-legged busker is immortalized in clay and in the contemporary engraving that was the figure's design source. Billy Waters even appeared in a role in a play. This figure is a little smaller than the previous one, but it's titled. The potter was either ignorant or perhaps short of black paint, so he left Billy's skin white. This colourful Scottish bagpiper, made in the 1830s, required fewer moulds than most of the other figures we've seen today. By that time, the pottery industry was struggling, and simplification was becoming the order of the day. The angel Gabriel sounds farewell to my topic. Made by Sherritt, this figure includes a grim reminder: prepare to meet thy God. This completes our journey into the past, but you can see many more musicians within the covers of my books. Also, my website, mystaffordshirefigures.com, provides a wealth of information as well as free downloads of my 3-volume collection memoir titled Obsession and books on the works of individual potters. Thank you for watching. Remember, my help is always free, so if you have questions, email me.